The dust kicked up around her worn boots as she walked down the main street of Cedar Flats for what she knew would be the last time. 26-year-old Margaret had lived in this small Arizona Territory town her entire life, but she had never truly belonged here. From the moment she was born, life had dealt her what most people saw as a losing hand. A childhood illness had left her with a noticeable limp that made her walk with a careful, measured gait. But it was the deep red birthmark that covered half her face like spilled wine that really made people stare. Children would point and whisper. Adults would quickly look away as if her appearance might somehow be catching. Her father, Thomas, had been the town's only schoolteacher for 15 years. He was a kind man who never made her feel different or broken. Intelligence and kindness matter more than a pretty face, he would tell her whenever the cruel comments from townspeople got too heavy to bear. He taught her to read and write better than most men in town. He showed her maps of faraway places and told her stories of great women who changed the world. But 3 weeks ago, her father had died suddenly from a fever that took him in just 4 days. Margaret had nursed him as best she could, but the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. The funeral had been small. A few people came out of respect for her father's service to the community, but Margaret could feel their eagerness to leave. She stood alone by the grave after everyone else had gone, wondering what would happen to her now. The answer came quickly enough. Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, arrived at Margaret's small house behind the schoolhouse 3 days after the funeral. She stood in the doorway, refusing to come inside, her nose wrinkled as if something smelled bad. "We've made a decision about the school," Mrs. Henderson announced in her sharp voice. "The town council has voted to bring in a proper teacher from back east. A young man with the right qualifications." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "But I've been helping my father teach for years. I know all the children. I know the lessons." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "A teacher needs to be someone the children can look up to, someone who won't frighten them or distract them from their studies." Her gaze moved pointedly to Margaret's birthmark. "We need someone normal." The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Normal. She had never been normal, and everyone in Cedar Flats had made sure she knew it. "When do I need to leave?" Margaret asked quietly. "The new teacher arrives next week. We'll need you out of the schoolhouse by then." Mrs. Henderson turned to go, then paused. "You might try the mining camps up north. They're not so particular about appearances." After Mrs. Henderson left, Margaret sat in the empty house and cried until no more tears would come. She had nowhere to go and no money except the few dollars her father had saved. No relatives had ever contacted them, and she had no friends who would take her in. Over the next few days, she tried to find work in town. She visited the general store, the saloon, even the livery stable. Every door was politely but firmly closed to her. People couldn't meet her eyes when they turned her away. Some were kind about it, but the answer was always the same. "We don't have anything suitable," they would say. What they meant was that customers wouldn't want to look at her while they conducted their business. The final blow came when she approached Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house. Margaret had hoped she might work there cleaning rooms in exchange for a place to stay. Mrs. Chen had always been one of the kinder people in town, but even she shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, child, but my boarders are mostly traveling businessmen and miners. They come here to rest, not to be reminded of the world's hardships. It wouldn't be fair to them or to you." That evening, Margaret packed her few belongings into a small canvas bag. She had 2 dresses, her father's Bible, a few books, and his pocket watch. She also took his walking stick, thinking it might help her manage better with her limp. She left the house before dawn, not wanting anyone to see her go. The desert stretched out before her, endless and empty. She had no plan except to walk until she couldn't walk anymore. Maybe she would find another town where people didn't know her story. Maybe she would find a place where she could start over. But as the sun rose higher and the heat began to press down on her, Margaret began to doubt she would make it anywhere at all. The desert was not kind to the unprepared, and she was already tired from her restless night. By midday, her water was running low. Her limp made walking on the uneven ground even more difficult than usual. Several times she stumbled and fell, scraping her hands and knees on the rocky terrain. The birthmark on her face seemed to burn in the harsh sun, making her more self-conscious than ever. She thought about her father and the stories he used to tell her about brave people who faced impossible challenges. But those were just stories, and she was just a broken woman with nowhere to go. As afternoon turned to evening, Margaret found herself sitting on a large rock staring at the setting sun. She had walked farther from Cedar Flats than she had ever been in her life, but she might as well have been on the moon. The desert around her was completely empty except for scrubby bushes and the occasional lizard darting between rocks. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to think about giving up entirely. What was the point of struggling, when the world had made it clear there was no place for someone like her? She pulled out her father's pocket watch and looked at it in the fading light. 6:30 in the evening. Back in Cedar Flats, people would be sitting down to dinner with their families. Children would be playing in the streets. Normal people living normal lives. "I don't know what to do, Papa," she whispered to the empty desert. "I don't know where I belong." The wind picked up as darkness began to fall, carrying with it the howl of distant coyotes. Margaret shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She would have to find shelter soon, but there was nothing around her except open space and stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long, and began walking again. She didn't know where she was going, but stopping here meant certain death. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. As she limped forward into the growing darkness, Margaret didn't know that her real life was about to begin. She couldn't imagine that someone would soon see her not as broken or damaged, but as exactly what they had been looking for. She had no way of knowing that the empty desert ahead held more acceptance and love than the town behind her ever could. All she knew was that each step took her farther from everything she had ever known, deeper into an uncertain future that felt as vast and unknowable as the star-filled sky above her head. 3 days had passed since Margaret left Cedar Flats, and she was dying. The desert sun had burned her skin despite her attempts to stay in what little shade she could find. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The small amount of water she had brought was gone, finished yesterday morning when she still had hope she might find a stream or a town. Her father's walking stick had become essential now, not just for her limp, but to keep her upright at all. Every step was an effort that required all her remaining strength. The birthmark on her face felt like it was on fire, and she wondered dimly if sunburn could make it worse. She had seen no signs of civilization since leaving town. No roads, no houses, no people. Just endless rocks, sparse vegetation, and a merciless sun that seemed determined to drain every drop of moisture from her body. On this third morning, Margaret could barely stand. She had spent the night shivering under a large boulder, listening to the sounds of animals moving in the darkness around her. When dawn came, she tried to continue walking, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. "This is it," she whispered to herself, her voice barely a croak. "This is how it ends." She found a patch of shade beside a large desert plant and sat down heavily. Everything hurt. Her head was pounding and spots danced in front of her eyes. She closed them and tried to remember her father's voice, the stories he used to tell, anything that might make the end easier. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her eyes snap open. For a moment she thought she might be dreaming or hallucinating from the heat. But no, someone was definitely approaching. A woman appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, moving quietly and purposefully. She was clearly Apache, with long black hair braided with small beads and wearing traditional clothing made of soft leather. She carried a large basket and seemed to know exactly where she was going. Margaret tried to stand, to run, to do something, but she was too weak. Everything she had ever heard about Apache people rushed through her mind. Stories of raids and kidnappings, of settlers who disappeared and were never seen again. But she was too exhausted to feel the fear she probably should have felt. The Apache woman stopped when she saw Margaret. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small clearing. Margaret waited for whatever was going to happen next, too tired to fight or flee. Then the woman approached slowly, her dark eyes taking in Margaret's condition. She knelt beside her and said something in a language Margaret didn't understand, but her voice was gentle, concerned. The woman reached into her basket and pulled out a small clay pot. She removed the lid and held it out to Margaret. Water. Cool, clean water. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the pot. She tried to drink slowly, but the water was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The Apache woman watched carefully, taking the pot away when Margaret had drunk enough, then offering it again after a few moments. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, the first words she had been able to speak clearly in days. The woman nodded and said something else in Apache. When Margaret looked confused, the woman pointed to herself and said slowly, "Ayana." Margaret understood. "Margaret," she replied, pointing to her own chest. Ayana studied Margaret's face, but not the way people in Cedar Flats did. She wasn't staring at the birthmark with disgust or pity. She seemed to be looking at Margaret as a whole person, trying to understand her situation. After giving Margaret more water and some kind of dried fruit that tasted wonderful, Ayana stood and gestured for Margaret to follow her. Margaret tried to explain that she couldn't walk much farther, but Ayana seemed to understand without words. She helped Margaret to her feet and let her lean on her strong shoulder. They walked slowly, Ayana adjusting her pace to Margaret's limited abilities. They moved through the desert landscape with Ayana clearly knowing exactly where she was going. Margaret marveled at how the Apache woman could find her way through what looked to her like identical rocks and bushes. After what felt like hours, but was probably much less, they reached a small camp hidden in a canyon between high rock walls. Several traditional Apache shelters called wickiups were arranged around a small fire. Margaret counted maybe 15 or 20 people, mostly women and children, with a few older men. As they entered the camp, people looked up with curiosity, but not alarm. Ayana spoke quickly in Apache, gesturing to Margaret. An older woman came forward and examined Margaret with the same careful attention Ayana had shown. She spoke to Ayana, and Margaret heard concern in her voice even though she couldn't understand the words. They led Margaret to one of the shelters and helped her lie down on soft furs. Someone brought her more water and some kind of broth that tasted like nothing she had ever had but warmed her from the inside out. For the first time in days, Margaret felt safe. As she drifted in and out of sleep, she was dimly aware of people moving around the camp, going about their daily activities. Children played games she didn't recognize. Women worked with their hands, making things she couldn't identify. The sounds were peaceful, family-like. When she woke fully, it was late afternoon. The light filtering into the wickiup was golden and soft. She sat up slowly, surprised to find that she felt much better. Someone had cleaned the dust from her face and hands, and her clothes had been brushed off. Ayana appeared in the doorway of the shelter. Behind her was a man Margaret hadn't seen before. He was tall and strong-looking, with the kind of bearing that suggested he was important in the group. His long hair was decorated with small feathers, and he wore traditional Apache clothing that looked well-made and carefully maintained. What struck Margaret most, though, was his face. He had strong, handsome features, but there was something in his eyes that looked familiar. A kind of sadness, maybe, or the look of someone who had seen difficulties. Ayana spoke to him in Apache, pointing to Margaret. The man listened, then looked directly at Margaret. Unlike everyone back in Cedar Flats, he didn't look away when he saw her birthmark. He didn't stare at it either. He just looked at her as if she were any other person. He said something to Ayana, then approached Margaret slowly. When he was a few feet away, he spoke in careful English. "You are far from your people," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, with an accent that made his English sound different but not hard to understand. Margaret nodded. "I had nowhere else to go." He studied her for a moment. "I am called Nalnish. Ayana says you were dying in the desert." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I was." "Why?" The question was direct but not unkind. Margaret found herself telling the stranger things she had never told anyone. About her father's death, about losing her home, about the people in Cedar Flats, who couldn't stand to look at her. "They said no man would ever want someone like me," she heard herself saying, surprised by her own honesty. "They said I was too different, too damaged." Nalnish was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. When he finally responded, his words were so unexpected that Margaret was sure she had misheard him. "Then I will want you more than warriors want glory." Margaret stared at him. "What?" He repeated the words, speaking even more carefully this time. "If no man of your people wanted you, then I want you more than warriors want glory." Margaret felt tears start to flow down her cheeks. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She didn't even understand what he meant, but something in his voice told her he was completely serious. "Why?" she whispered. Nalnish looked at her steadily. "Because the spirits mark some people to show they are special. Your people do not understand this." He gestured to her birthmark. "Among my people, this would be seen as a sign that you have strong medicine, that you see things others cannot see." Margaret touched her face self-consciously. "In my world, it makes me ugly. Your world is wrong," Nalnish said simply. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself in the most unusual situation of her life. She was sitting around a fire, with people she had been taught to fear, eating food she couldn't identify, listening to a language she didn't understand, and for the first time since her father died, she felt like she might have a future. Nalnish sat across the fire from her, and several times she caught him looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at herself before. It wasn't pity or disgust or even curiosity. It was something that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks grow warm despite the cool evening air. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen something worth wanting. That alone was more than she had ever hoped for. Margaret had been with Nalnish's band for 2 weeks now, and every day brought new surprises that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. Her strength had returned thanks to Ayana's careful nursing and the nourishing food the Apache women prepared. She had expected to be treated as a prisoner or an outsider, but instead, she found herself slowly being welcomed into the daily life of the camp. Ayana had become her closest friend and teacher. Despite the language barrier, they had developed ways to communicate that went beyond words. Ayana would point to things and say their Apache names, then listen as Margaret repeated them. In return, Margaret taught Ayana English words, and they would both laugh at each other's attempts at pronunciation. "Water," Ayana would say carefully, pointing to the stream that ran through their canyon. "Two," Margaret would respond, trying to wrap her tongue around the Apache word. Through these lessons, Margaret began to understand that Apache culture was nothing like what she had been told in Cedar Flats. These weren't savage raiders who lived without rules or kindness. They were families with complex traditions, deep spiritual beliefs, and a sophisticated understanding of the desert that had kept them alive for generations. The women taught her which plants could be eaten and which ones had healing properties. They showed her how to weave baskets from desert grasses and how to prepare animal hides for clothing. Margaret was amazed by their skill and knowledge, but it was her growing friendship with Nalnish that truly opened her eyes to how wrong her people had been about the Apache. Every evening after the day's work was done, Nalnish would sit with her by the fire, and they would practice each other's languages. His English was much better than her Apache, but he was patient with her efforts. "Why do you want to learn our words?" he asked her one night. "Because I want to understand," Margaret replied. "I want to know what people are saying about me." Nalnish smiled. "They say you are brave. They say you have a good heart." "Really?" "Yes. Ayana tells everyone how you help with the children, how you learn quickly, how you do not complain even though this life is very different from yours." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "In my world, people think I'm cursed because of how I look." "Your world has strange ideas," Nalnish said. "We believe the Creator marks some people because they have important work to do. Your mark shows you are chosen for something special." Through their conversations, Margaret learned that Nalnish understood rejection in his own way. His mother had been from a different Apache band, captured during a raid when she was young. Though she had eventually married his father and become part of the community, some people had always questioned Nalnish's full acceptance because of his mixed heritage. "I had to prove myself many times," he told her. "I had to be a better warrior, a better hunter, a better man than others just to be seen as equal." But you succeeded, Margaret said. Everyone respects you here. Yes, but it was not easy. And sometimes, even now, I wonder if I truly belong. These conversations helped Margaret understand why Nalnish had been so quick to defend her. Why? He saw something in her that others missed. They both knew what it felt like to be judged for things they couldn't control. As her Apache improved, Margaret began to contribute more to the camp in ways that surprised everyone. Her education, which had been seen as useless back in Cedar Flats, proved valuable here. She could read the official papers that sometimes found their way to the camp, documents from the army or the territorial government that affected Apache people. One day, a writer brought news that the army was planning to move all Apache bands to a reservation far to the south. The message was in English, and the Apache men were frustrated by their inability to understand the full meaning. Margaret read the document carefully and explained what it said. The language was formal and confusing even to her, but she was able to translate the important parts. They want all Apache people to go to San Carlos, she explained to the gathered leaders. They say anyone who doesn't go will be considered hostile. The news created serious discussion among the band's leaders. Some wanted to fight. Others thought they should try to hide deeper in the mountains. A few believed they should negotiate. What do you think we should do? Nalnish asked Margaret privately later that night. I don't know enough about Apache ways to say, Margaret replied. But I know how the army thinks. They have more soldiers and more weapons than you do. Fighting them directly would be very dangerous. But if we go to the reservation, we lose our freedom. We lose our way of life. Margaret nodded. I understand it's not a good choice either way. Could you write a letter for us, to the army commanders? Maybe if they understood us better, they would listen. Margaret was touched that he would trust her with something so important. She spent the next day crafting a letter that explained the band's peaceful intentions while requesting permission to remain in their traditional territory. She tried to use the formal language that army officials would respect while conveying the genuine concerns of Nalnish's people. When the letter was finished, Nalnish read it with the help of one of the older men who knew some English. They were impressed with Margaret's ability to express their thoughts in ways that might reach the officials. You have a gift with words, Nalnish told her. This could help our people. Whether the letter would make any difference remained to be seen, but Margaret felt useful in a way she never had before. Her education wasn't a burden or a sign that she was too different to fit in. Here, it was a tool that could help protect people she was growing to care about. As autumn approached, Margaret realized she had stopped thinking about finding another town or trying to return to white society. She woke up each morning eager to see what Ayana would teach her that day. She looked forward to her evening conversations with Nalnish. She enjoyed playing with the children who had completely accepted her and didn't seem to notice her birthmark at all. One evening, as she sat by the fire working on a basket that Ayana was teaching her to weave, Nalnish sat down beside her. Margaret, he said, using her English name carefully. May I ask you something? Of course. Do you miss your old life? She considered the question seriously. I miss my father. I always will. But everything else? She shook her head. I was never truly alive there. I was just existing, waiting for people to accept me, or at least ignore me. And now? Margaret looked around the camp. Children were playing a game with stones. Women were preparing the evening meal. Men were working on weapons and tools. Everyone had a place, a purpose, a role in the community. Now I feel like I'm part of something, she said. Like I belong somewhere for the first time in my life. Nalnish nodded slowly. Good. Because I want to ask you something else, but I wanted to be sure you were happy here first. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. What did you want to ask? I want to know if you would consider staying permanently, not as a guest or a refugee, but as one of us, as my wife. The question hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Margaret stared at him, hardly able to believe what she had heard. You want to marry me? Yes. I have wanted to ask for days now, but I wanted you to feel at home here first. I wanted you to choose this life because you want it, Not because you have nowhere else to go. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. But I'm not Apache. I don't know all your ways, I'm still learning the language. You can learn. Ayanna will teach you everything you need to know, and I will help you. But she touched her birthmark, the old insecurity rising up despite everything she had learned. Nalnish reached out and gently took her hand away from her face. You are beautiful. You are intelligent. You are kind. You are everything I want in a wife. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. This man, who could have chosen any woman in his band, who was respected as a warrior and leader, truly wanted her. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I want to stay. I want to be your wife? Nalnish smiled more broadly than she had ever seen him smile. Then we will do this the right way. I will speak to the elders. There are ceremonies, traditions to follow. But first we must give you an Apache name. A new name? Margaret is who you were in your old life. Here you need a name that reflects who you are becoming. As they sat together in the firelight, Margaret felt the last pieces of her old self falling away. She was about to become someone entirely new, someone who was wanted and valued and loved. The scared, lonely woman who had walked into the desert to die was disappearing, replaced by someone she was only beginning to discover. For the first time in her life, the future looked bright with possibilities instead of dark with limitations. The Apache elders had accepted Nalnish's request to marry Margaret, but first she needed to prove herself worthy of joining the tribe permanently. This meant learning not just the language and daily customs, but the deeper spiritual and cultural traditions that bound the Apache people together. Ayanna became her guide through this process, teaching her the sacred stories, the meanings behind ceremonies, and the complex relationships between the Apache people and the natural world around them. To be Apache wife, you must understand Apache heart, Ayanna explained in her improving English. Must know why we do things, not just how. Margaret threw herself into learning with the same dedication she had once applied to her father's lessons. She learned about the 4 sacred directions and what they represented. She learned the proper way to gather plants for food and medicine, including the prayers that should be said to thank the spirits for their gifts. Most importantly, she learned about the complex kinship system that determined relationships within the band. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities based on their family connections, and Margaret needed to understand where she would fit in this network. The process wasn't always easy. Some of the older women were skeptical about accepting a white woman into their community. They tested Margaret's patience and commitment in subtle ways, giving her the most difficult tasks and watching to see how she responded. Margaret knew she was being evaluated, but instead of becoming discouraged, she worked even harder. She woke before dawn to help with the morning chores. She spent long hours practicing traditional crafts until her fingers bled. She memorized Apache words and phrases with the determination of someone whose life depended on it. Slowly, the doubts began to fade. The women saw that Margaret wasn't just playing at being Apache, she was truly trying to become one of them. Her willingness to do any job without complaining, combined with her obvious devotion to Nalnish, gradually won them over. Meanwhile, Margaret's relationship with Nalnish deepened in ways she had never imagined possible. He showed her sacred places in the desert where his people had lived for generations, hidden springs where ancient petroglyphs told stories of the past, secret canyons where medicinal plants grew in abundance. My ancestors walked these paths, he told her, as they stood on a high ridge looking out over the vast landscape. Their spirits are still here, watching over us. Margaret felt a connection to the land that she had never experienced in Cedar Flats. The desert, which had once seemed empty and hostile, now revealed itself as full of life and meaning. Every rock formation had a story. Every plant had a purpose. Every wind pattern carried information about weather and game. But their growing love faced challenges from the outside world. Word had spread among both Apache and white communities about their relationship, and not everyone approved. Some Apache men questioned Nalnish's choice, suggesting that he was betraying his people by taking a white woman as his wife. They pointed out that her presence might bring unwanted attention from the army, putting the entire band at risk. The criticism hurt, but Nalnish defended his decision firmly. The heart chooses what the heart chooses, he told his critics. She has proven her loyalty to our people. She has shown respect for our ways. She belongs with us now. The reaction from white settlers was even harsher. When traders came through the area and heard about Margaret, they brought news back to the towns and settlements. The story spread quickly through the territory. A white woman had gone Indian and was living with an Apache band. One day, a small group of soldiers arrived at the canyon, led by a young lieutenant who demanded to speak with Margaret. Nalnish and the other warriors were ready to fight, but Margaret stepped forward to handle the situation herself. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, touching his hat politely but keeping his distance. "I'm Lieutenant Collins. We've heard reports that you're being held here against your will." Margaret almost laughed. "No one is holding me against my will, Lieutenant. I chose to be here." The young soldier looked confused. "But ma'am, these are hostile Indians. You can't seriously want to live with them." "They are not hostile," Margaret replied firmly. "They are peaceful people trying to live their lives without bothering anyone. Ma'am, I have orders to escort you back to civilization if you want to come." Margaret looked back at the camp where Nalnish and the others were waiting. Tensely, she saw Ayana holding her hand to her heart in worry. She saw the children peeking out from behind their mother's skirts. She saw Nalnish watching her with complete trust, knowing she would make the right choice. "This is my civilization now, Lieutenant," she said. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm exactly where I want to be." The lieutenant argued with her for another few minutes, warning her about the dangers of living with savages and reminding her of her duty to her own race. But Margaret stood firm, and eventually the soldiers left, shaking their heads at what they saw as her foolishness. After they were gone, Nalnish approached her carefully. "You could have left with them. They would have taken you to safety." "Safety? From what?" Margaret asked. "From people who care about me? From a man who loves me? From a place where I'm valued for who I am instead of judged for how I look?" That night, Nalnish formally asked the elders for permission to begin the traditional marriage process. It was a complex ceremony that would take place over several days, involving rituals that dated back generations. But first, Margaret needed her Apache name. The elders had been discussing this for weeks, watching her actions and considering her character. Names in Apache culture weren't just labels. They reflected a person's essence, their role in the community, their connection to the spiritual world. The naming ceremony took place on a clear autumn evening when the whole band gathered around a sacred fire. The eldest woman in the group, a tiny grandmother everyone called Old Mother, stood and spoke in Apache for several minutes. Then she turned to Margaret and spoke in careful English. "We have watched you, white daughter. We have seen your heart. You came to us broken, but you have made yourself whole. You came to us as a stranger, but you have become family. You came to us marked by your Creator, and we see now that this marking shows your medicine, your power." Old Mother gestured to Margaret's birthmark, but her words transformed its meaning completely. "You will be called Bike Hojun," her beauty follows. Not beauty of the face, but beauty of the spirit that follows wherever you go. Beauty that makes things better, that brings learning and peace and understanding. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as Ayana and the other women ululated in celebration. Nalnish stepped forward and took her hands. "Bike Hojun," he said softly, trying out her new name. "It suits you perfectly." The marriage ceremony began the next day with Nalnish demonstrating his ability to provide for a wife by bringing gifts of food and handmade items to Margaret's adopted family. Ayana had formally taken Margaret as a sister, which meant the gifts went to her. Margaret, in turn, had to show her domestic skills by preparing special foods and creating items that proved she could maintain a household. The Apache women had taught her well, and she was proud to display the baskets, clothing, and other items she had made. But the most meaningful part of the ceremony was the exchange of vows, spoken in both Apache and English, so that Margaret could fully understand and participate. They promised not just to love each other, but to honor each other's spirits, to work together for the good of their people, and to face whatever challenges the future might bring as partners. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret, now Bike, Hojun, settled into her new life as Nalnish's wife. They built their own wiki up at the edge of the camp, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough away to have privacy. But even as they celebrated their love, both of them knew that the outside world was closing in around them. The army's pressure on Apache bands was increasing. More soldiers were being sent to the territory. The peaceful life they were building together might not last much longer. Still, they had each other, and they had found something that neither had expected: a love strong enough to bridge two worlds, deep enough to overcome any obstacle, and pure enough to transform them both into better versions of themselves. In the firelight of their new home, as winter wind whistled through the canyon, they held each other and planned for a future that might be uncertain, but would definitely be faced together. Winter passed peacefully in the hidden canyon, but spring brought troubling news. Apache scouts reported increased army activity throughout the territory. Several bands had already been forced onto the San Carlos reservation, and those who resisted were being hunted down with increasing determination. Nalnish and the other leaders held long councils discussing their options. They could try to reach Mexico, where some Apache bands had found refuge. They could attempt to negotiate with the army, or they could go deeper into the mountains and hope to stay hidden until the pressure passed. Bike Hozun, as Margaret was now known to everyone, found herself playing an unexpected role in these discussions. Her ability to read and write English, combined with her understanding of how government officials thought, made her valuable as an advisor. "The army isn't going to give up," she told the council one evening. "They have orders from Washington to move all Apache people to reservations. They see it as the only way to end the conflicts and open up the territory for white settlers." "Then we must fight," said one of the younger warriors. "Fighting will only give them an excuse to use more force," Bike Hojun replied. "But maybe there's another way." She had been thinking about this problem for weeks, trying to find a solution that would protect the people she now considered her family. Finally, she had an idea that might work. What if we found a place where the army couldn't reach us, but we weren't technically hiding from them either? Somewhere remote enough that they wouldn't bother coming after us, but legal enough that they couldn't call us hostiles? Nalnish leaned forward. "What kind of place?" "I've been studying the territorial maps and documents I've seen. There are areas in the deep mountains that haven't been surveyed or claimed yet. If we could establish ourselves there and prove we're not causing any trouble, we might be able to stay." The elders discussed this idea extensively. It was risky, but it offered hope for maintaining their freedom while avoiding a war they couldn't win. They decided to try it. In early summer, the entire band began moving deeper into the mountains, seeking a place where they could build a permanent home hidden from the outside world. After weeks of careful traveling, they found it. A narrow canyon accessible only through a concealed entrance with its own water source and enough space for a small community. The walls were so high and the entrance so well hidden that aircraft would never spot them, and anyone on horseback would have to know exactly where to look. "This could work," Nalnish said as they explored the canyon. "We could build a village here that would be invisible to outsiders." Bike Hojun was already imagining the possibilities. The canyon had flat areas perfect for growing crops. There were caves that could be used for storage. The rock walls would provide protection from weather and enemies alike. But more than that, she saw an opportunity to create something new, a community that combined the best of both Apache and white cultures while avoiding the worst of both. "Want to start a school?" she told Nalnish one evening as they sat by their fire in the new camp. "A school? For the children. I want to teach them to read and write in both English and Apache. I want them to know their own traditions and stories, but also to understand the outside world they'll have to deal with someday." Nalnish considered this carefully. Education had always been important to Apache people, but it usually focused on traditional skills and knowledge. What Bike Hozun was proposing was different. "You think they need both kinds of learning?" "I think they need every advantage they can get," she replied. "The world is changing whether we like it or not. If our children understand both worlds, they'll be better able to protect our people and our ways." The elders approved the idea, and Bike Hozun began teaching the children in a natural classroom formed by smooth rocks and shaded by ancient trees. She taught them arithmetic and geography, alongside traditional Apache knowledge about plants and animals. She helped them write down old stories that had always been passed on through spoken word. The children loved learning, and their parents began to see the value in what Bike Hozun was doing. The young people were becoming bridges between two worlds, able to navigate both with confidence. As the seasons passed, their hidden community grew stronger and more established. They built permanent structures that blended traditional Apache techniques with ideas Bike Hozun contributed from her white upbringing. They developed sustainable methods for growing food and preserving resources. Most importantly, they stayed hidden from the army's attention. Occasional scouting parties passed through the area, but none discovered the concealed entrance to their canyon. In their second year in the hidden valley, Bike Hozun gave birth to her first child, a daughter they named Ayana's Gift in honor of the woman who had first saved Bike Hozun's life. The baby was healthy and beautiful, with her father's strong features and her mother's intelligent eyes. She will grow up knowing both worlds, but belonging to neither and both, Bike Hozun said as she nursed her daughter. She will be something new. Over the next few years, 2 more children followed, a son and another daughter. Bike Hozun's family grew alongside the community, and she watched with pride as the children she taught became young adults who were equally comfortable with traditional Apache ways and modern skills. The school became more than just a place of learning. It became a center where the community could discuss problems, plan for the future, and preserve their culture. Bike Hozun helped the elders write down important stories and traditions that had previously existed only in memory. She also served as a translator and mediator when occasional contact with the outside world became necessary. Traders sometimes found their way to the hidden canyon, and Bike Hozun's ability to speak both languages and understand both cultures made her invaluable in these negotiations. But perhaps most importantly, she became a bridge between past and future for her adopted people. She helped them adapt to changing times without losing their essential identity. Years later, when territorial officials finally learned of the hidden community, they found not a band of hostile savages, but a peaceful, self-sufficient village led by people who could read and write and negotiate as equals. The community had become too established and too obviously peaceful to be forced onto a reservation. As Bike Hozun aged, she often sat in the evening light watching her grandchildren play the same games she had once watched their parents play. The birthmark on her face had faded somewhat with age, but it no longer mattered. The children saw her as grandmother, a respected elder who told wonderful stories and taught them important things. One evening when she was in her 70s, a young historian came to the canyon. He had heard stories about the white woman who had gone Apache decades earlier and wanted to interview her about her experiences. "Do you ever regret your choice?" he asked as they sat by the fire that still burned in the center of the village each night. Bike Hozun looked around at the community she had helped build, at the school where children learned in 2 languages, at the gardens that fed families year-round, at the young adults who could navigate both Apache and white societies with equal skill. "Regret?" she smiled. "Young man, I was never truly alive until I came here. In my old life, I was just surviving. Here, I found my purpose. But you gave up your own culture, your own people. I didn't give up anything important. I gained everything that mattered. I found love, family, purpose, and a place where my contributions were valued. I found people who saw my differences as gifts instead of curses." The historian scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture her words. "What would you say to other people who feel like they don't fit in their own world?" Bike Hozun was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky above the canyon walls. "I would tell them that sometimes you have to leave the place where you were born to find the place where you belong. I would tell them that love can cross any boundary if both people are willing to build bridges. And I would tell them that what makes you different might be exactly what the world needs from you." As the fire died down and the interview ended, Bike Hozun reflected on the long journey that had brought her from Cedar Flats to this hidden canyon. She had walked into the desert expecting to die, and instead she had found the life she was meant to live. The scared, rejected young woman who had limped out of town with nothing but a few belongings and a broken heart had become a respected elder, a beloved teacher, and the bridge between two worlds. Her children and grandchildren carried the best of both cultures forward into an uncertain future. She had found her home not in a place on any map, but in the love of people who saw her truly and valued her completely. And in doing so, she had helped create something new and beautiful, a community where differences were celebrated, where learning was treasured, and where love really could conquer the boundaries that divided worlds. As she prepared for sleep, in the wiki-up she still shared with Nalnish after all these years, Bike Hojun whispered a prayer of gratitude for the day she had walked into the desert and found not death, but life beyond anything she had ever imagined possible.